Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! I work at a restaurant where the employees are overworked and underpaid. Despite this, everyone is cool with each other and the management. The evils that mess up our day are the customers and our by-the-book district manager who drops by every now and then. For about 3 months, we had someone in the men's bathroom come in and smear a big amount of fecal matter all over the handicapped stall of the men's bathroom. Even sometimes they'll fling scat outside of the stall onto another toilet or a wall. Of course, management sent one of us peons to clean it up. Fortunately for me, I never had to, as I worked the cash register. The one co-worker, who we will call Arthur, was who I call the personification of pittiness. He was crazy and had a smart mouth and an explosive temper when pushed too far. Arthur and I were cool. I never had problems with him, but management always had him clean out the bathroom when it was poo smeared. One day, Arthur came in on his day off to get some food. After placing his order, he went to use a restroom. While there, he heard someone moan and groan having a massive poop in a handicapped stall. He didn't think much of it even when he smelled the awful scent. An older gentleman around 50 exited the stall. Arthur came out and noticed the smell was even stronger than before. Curious, he peeked into the stall and noticed the poop smears all over the place. Infuriated, he asked the old man if he had done that and why would he even. The old guy said with a big grin, "Look, I don't care. I just want to ruin some poor person's day." Arthur was set off, as he was that poor person. Initially, Arthur wanted to clog the guy right then and there, but in his own words, time slowed down around him and all he saw was red. Arthur didn't say anything to the man, instead washed his hands and sat back down waiting for his food. He sat on the opposite end of the restaurant, but the location provided an overview of the entire floor. He could see the old man at his booth munching away like nothing happened. Of course, someone complained that there were poop smeared all over, and one of the other employees that Arthur was cool with had to go clean up the mess. Arthur caught the old guy looking on at the situation and grinning to himself. Seeing that, Arthur thought the man needed to be taught a hard and hurtful lesson. The old guy finished his food and drove home. Little did he know that Arthur was following him. He ends up following the old guy to his home and watches him out for an hour. Arthur does this for a couple of weeks, following him home, learning about this guy as quickly as possible. Even on days off, he drove over to where he lived and followed him to both the restaurant and to his company. Arthur got a rough idea of this guy's work and sleep schedule, so it was time to enact his revenge. Going by the information he acquired about the guy's activities and the neighborhood he lived in, Arthur figured out that this guy lived well enough to survive, but had no means of backup if something were to happen. Arthur had a 3-part plan for him. First act. In the dead of night, Arthur went to the old guy's house. He slashed one of his tires. The old guy drove a jeep, so Arthur opened the spare tire compartment and poked a single hole in it. The old guy woke up the following morning to find his tire flat. According to Arthur, the old man was on the phone freaking out because he was going to be running late for work and really didn't have the money to get a new tire. Not only that, to Arthur's surprise, the old guy didn't know how to change a tire. The old guy spent nearly 2 hours in the hot Texas morning heat on the phone with someone on how to put the spare tire on. This is important for later in this act. At this point, Arthur is foaming at the mouth with excitement. The old guy drove on a spare to work only to find out that afternoon that the spare went flat. Even more frustrated, the old man drives the car to a nearby auto shop to get both tires serviced. Later that night, this time Arthur slashed 3 out of 4 of his tires. Remember when the old guy was on the phone getting instructions on how to get his tire fixed? Well, before that, he had called his car insurance company to get someone to come out and fix his tire. It was very loud, and the gist of the conversation was that the insurance company wouldn't come out and fix his tires and couldn't get them insured because all 4 tires weren't blown out. They said it would be easier and less expensive to just change the tire himself and get another. So later that night, Arthur slashed the other 3 tires save for the new one. Arthur wasn't there that following morning, but he knew that the old guy surely had a meltdown. Then he didn't show up to the restaurant for a month. Second act. Piggybacking on a first act, Arthur would regularly check on the old guy's car. When all the tires were replaced, Arthur went to the old guy's house late at night and poured 1.5 gallons of sugar and bleach into the gas tank. His car had one of those manual gas covers instead of the modern button inside the car, so no one was none the wiser. In the morning, during Arthur's takeout, the old man started his car up and left for work, only to get halfway there before the car stopped working. So the old guy had to get his car towed to his house. And now to the final act. Arthur got the old guy's name from the phone conversation and searched him on Facebook. He downloaded a couple of good pictures of him and created a few flyers. Due to the old guy's car being unusable, he wasn't able to come into the restaurant to do his usual crap. Pun intended. Arthur printed the flyers out and posted them all over the restaurant. The flyers had a picture of the guy, his name, and described what he did in the bathrooms for the past few months. A few days later, the old guy comes in with a friend. The friend goes ahead and orders while the old guy runs to the bathroom. One of the co-workers spotted him and notified everyone there, including the friend. Old guy starts to do his thing in a stall until he sees a flyer with his face on it. He storms out of the bathroom, flyer in hand, angrily demanding for the person responsible to step up to him. Arthur steps up in his uniform and claims responsibility. The old guy begins threatening to sue for slander and emotional damages, and other offenses, to which Arthur simply says, with an equally scat-eating grin, "Look, I don't care. I just want to ruin some poor person's day." The old guy's soul momentarily leaves his body as he realizes that the same guy he confessed his crime 2 weeks ago was one of the employees. The managers arrive and ban the old guy from the restaurant. The old guy threatens to ram his car into the windows, to which Arthur says, "Is your car a unicycle? Better check your tires, you poor person." The old guy then realizes that Arthur was behind the attacks. Banned from the restaurant, no hard evidence of Arthur's vandalism, and extreme embarrassment, the old guy decides to bow out. Haven't seen him or heard from him since. I'm a professional baker and have worked for various companies developing recipes and the like. I found a job at a local grocery store working super early mornings on their pastries for the day. There were usually a few other people there, one of whom was a mixer. Mixers typically follow a spec sheet with the weights of all the ingredients they need to batch mix. It's kind of mindless work and doesn't require much thought. He was a young guy, fresh out of his teens. We became fast co-worker friends and enjoyed chatting it up about baking, and I'd help him put our supply order away. Good times. One day, a woman with a thick Russian accent came in and handed us business cards. She told us whatever we're getting paid, her company would double it if we came to work for them. I scheduled an interview thinking this would be a great opportunity for me. It was a new grocery store concept, like a glitzy glammy European-style Costco, whatever that means. When I went in for the interview, the place was literally still under construction. I met their lead baker and we hit it off right away. He warned me that the big boss had interesting tastes, and we'd need to work with that. No biggie, more money, let's go. They hired us both, and over the next several months, it was a really interesting and fun experience. The big boss, thick, burly Russian man to the point and perpetually angry, wanted this place to be like Costco, mass production of quality pastries. They were bringing in crazy amounts of new equipment, including folders, shavers, and injectors that were easily worth millions. We didn't have much equipment to start, and we were doing a lot of mixing in trash cans. Remember my mixer buddy? Well, he was working on a bread dough using spec sheets provided by our lead baker. Over time, they were bringing on more staff, and it was a lot of fun developing new recipes, experimenting with ratios, and figuring out how to get over constraints for the types of products the boss wanted. Did I mention he was a jerk? Oh yeah. When he was reviewing some cheesecake I had made, he said, "Good job, sweetie." I came back with "Miss, ma'am," or "My name is fine." He scowled at me, and from that point on he treated me like garbage. We brought other women on staff. I watched them hit on them. Some of the others were cool with being sexually harassed, I guess. This place was paying top dollar and had to get in good with a big boss, right? So the stage is set here. Boss quickly turned his business into a game of survivor. He'd fire people on the spot for whatever reason. One day, one of the people he sacked was our lead baker. It came as a surprise since he was developing all the recipes we'd be using. I inherited a lot of his notes and his development work was divided between me and the mixer. So this whole time Mixer was sucking up to Big Boss pretty hard. He was seeing an open position with the lead baker gone, and quickly became invested in the idea of him running the bakery show and making some serious money. At the same time, my relationship with the Big Boss was quickly declining. For example, I had him sample some cinnamon rolls I had made, and he came back with, "I hate these. They are terrible. What do you not like? We can't change anything about them. The dough, the filling, the icing? I don't know, I just don't like them." On a hunch, I gave some cinnamon rolls from the same batch to another lady there he had eyes for, and asked her if she'd present them to him as her own. She offered him the same product I had given him minutes before. He loved it. Anyway, I noticed that my notes were out of place one day, and the co-worker informed me my mixer buddy was stealing my work and presenting it as his own. He was also approaching me and asking a lot of baking questions, which was fine, but I knew that his knowledge of industrial ratio baking was mediocre at best. He was a mixer. Following a recipe is all he knew how to do. Knowing this, I made a decoy copy of my notes. But this time I put really awful recipes with huge amounts of salt and yeast. Anyone who knew how to build a recipe could probably look at it and go, "Whoa, that's a lot." Not the mixer buddy though. My original plan was to leave this in an obvious spot as bait and let him steal the awful recipes, but Big Boss had other plans. We sat down for a pre-launch meeting and he informed me that I wasn't going to be working in a bakery anymore and being relegated to store setup. The mixer was going to taking over as the lead baker. Guess all that sucking up really paid off. And I was to give him all my notes so far. No problem, boss. A day later was when the fun really began. The mixer mixed up a huge batch of super salty cake batter, and I heard Big Boss screaming at him about way too much salt. That's not even where the fun begins. As we were setting up industrial quantity baking equipment, we had to test the larger quantity mixing machines, and did a test run for some bread dough. It was my decoy recipe that had triple the yeast and sugar, and it didn't come out right. The mixer had to throw it all away. His choice? The dumpster out back in the dead heat of summer. Hundreds of pounds of dough. The fun thing about massive amounts of bread dough is that it doesn't magically stop rising if you throw it away, especially in a hot dumpster. A few hours later I spied out back to see Mixer Buddy shoveling this massive blob of dough into trash bags that had exploded from the dumpster like an uncovered blender spewing out of yeast-laden smoothie. Sweet revenge. Now about the mafia thing. The store was really strange. They had been ordering doubles of all the crazy industrial baking equipment and storing them in the back. We had nowhere to put any of this. I also looked up the company they were subcontracted under, and it was to a dead address in Russia. Big Boss also had armed security guards everywhere. This was a grocery store, mind you. I had a feeling that this company was more of a front for laundering a bunch of money. I eventually was fired by Big Boss, which was great because I had been job hunting, full well knowing that this business was a sinking ship. I had a new job lined up already. They had their grand opening, did business for 3 months, then closed. Rest in peace, Mixer. I had always been an active and adventurous person, but 6 years ago my life changed forever when I was involved in a car accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. It was a difficult adjustment and the loss of my mobility was hard to accept at first, but I was determined not to let my disability hold me back, and I worked hard to become as independent as possible. I used the wheelchair to get around and had a strong support system of family and friends who helped me with the tasks that were more challenging for me. One of those friends and support systems was my younger brother, who had always been very protective of me since my accident. I think it's because I was always very protective and kind to him when we were young, and he has always looked up to me. He never hesitated to lend me a helping hand or offer his support whenever I needed it, and I was grateful to having him by my side. On this particular day, my brother and his young family had invited me to join them at the aquarium. It was a hot summer day and the small aquarium was packed with families and tourists trying to escape the heat. The crowds were chaotic and it was difficult for me, being in a wheelchair, to see some of the exhibits due to my height. As I was trying to get a better view, a mother, let's call her Karen, and her two children pushed their way through the group. Karen and her children were pushing their way through the crowds, ignoring the polite requests of others to wait their turn and not block the walkways. They seemed to think that they were entitled to do whatever they wanted, without regard for the safety and convenience of others. They were making it difficult for everyone, especially for those who had mobility issues that were using strollers. Karen's children were also running around wildly, bumping into people and knocking over exhibits. They were loud and disruptive, and seemed to have no regard for the rules of the aquarium or the enjoyment of others. Karen did nothing to control them or teach them to behave, and instead seemed to be encouraging their bad behavior. As we were trying to get a better view of one of the exhibits, Karen and her children pushed their way through the group and tried to get in front of us. I asked her politely to give me some space and not block my view, but she became angry and started to argue with me. She told me that I was being rude and that she had the right to see the exhibits too. The argument quickly escalated, and before long, a staff member had to intervene and ask Karen to calm down and respect the needs of the disabled individuals. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down and respect the needs of the disabled individuals in this group. What are you talking about? I have the right to see the exhibits too. Yes, of course you do, but you also have the responsibility to be considerate of others and not block their view or disrupt their enjoyment of the aquarium. Your children are also running around wildly and knocking over exhibits, which is not acceptable behavior. Well, they are just kids. You can't expect them to sit still and be quiet all the time. No, but you can expect them to respect the rules of the aquarium and the enjoyment of others. And you, as their parent, have a responsibility to teach them to do so. If you can't control your kids and follow the rules, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You can't kick me out. I'm a paying customer. Ma'am, I understand that you're upset, but your behavior is not acceptable. If you cannot calm down and follow the rules, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'm not going anywhere. I want to speak to the manager. This lazy guy, points at me, doesn't deserve all the attention he's getting. Karen then began to throw a tantrum, getting loud and calling for the manager. When the manager arrived, she started yelling about how next time she visited the aquarium, she was going to find herself a wheelchair to sit in so that she would be treated like a little princess. She continued to argue and make demands, causing a scene and causing more chaos in the already crowded and chaotic aquarium. The manager, trying to de-escalate the situation, tried to reason with Karen and explain the importance of respecting the other visitors too, especially the disabled ones. But Karen was too blinded by her entitlement and refused to listen or apologize for her behavior. Eventually, the manager had no choice but to call security guards to remove Karen from the premises. As she was being escorted out, Karen continued to scream and cause a disturbance, causing even more embarrassment and shame for herself and her children. As Karen continued to throw a tantrum and cause a scene, my 4-year-old nephew became upset and frightened by her loud and aggressive behavior. He had always been very protective of me as well, and he could sense that Karen was causing me stress and discomfort. And without hesitation, he marched up to Karen and yelled at her to stop screaming at me. "Leave my uncle alone," he shouted. "You're a bad person. You're a bad person." Everyone in the aquarium was stunned by his boldness and bravery. and a hush fell over the crowd as they watched the confrontation unfold. Karen, taken aback by my nephew's defiance, got really angry and eventually snapped out of it and charged at him, ready to teach him a lesson, as she shouted. But my brother, who had been watching the scene with concern, quickly stepped in and grabbed Karen by the arm, stopping her in her tracks. "Yeah, over my dead body, witch," he shouted at her as he clocked her down to the floor. And yeah, we could all argue that he probably shouldn't have done that, especially in front of his kid, but I personally think you can't really judge a man for protecting his 4-year-old boy and his disabled brother from being attacked by a full-grown woman. It's completely justified in my opinion. Anyways, when the police arrived, they arrested Karen and charged her with assault and disturbing the peace. And as they left, my little soldier watched him go with a fierce look of protection and love in his eyes. I really love him, but sadly it doesn't end here. It had been a year since the incident at the aquarium, and it seems that everything went back to how it was before this whole incident took place. Nephew was starting kindergarten, going outside and making new friends, while Karen was supposedly serving time for the charges that were pressed against her that day. That's what I thought was happening until I heard recently from my brother that Karen had attempted to take my nephew from his kindergarten. She tried to convince his teacher that she was his aunt that was picking him up today on behalf of his mother, but my nephew, who had always been wise beyond his years, saw through Karen's deception and refused to go with her. He shouted for help and hid behind his teacher, who immediately called the police. Karen, realizing that her plan had failed, panicked and tried to flee, but she was quickly apprehended by the police and arrested for kidnapping and impersonation. As she was led away in handcuffs, Karen kept screaming about how my nephew was a reason for all this and how she blamed him for her losing custody of her children in the custody battle she had with their father, and that the least she could do is to take him away from his parents, just like they took her kids away from her. Hearing that was both terrifying and sad at the same time. This time Karen was locked behind bars for a very long time for attempting to kidnap my favorite little man. Strange how something so silly as the encounter we had at the aquarium could be the reason for locking someone up behind bars for a huge part of his life. You know what? If she needs help, I really hope she gets it somehow. First time posting here and a long one, so please buckle up. So this story happened back in 2009 when I was starting my sophomore year. 10th grade for anyone unfamiliar with the term. It's more my parents' revenge and I have their permission to post it here. I'm reminded of it now because I was on a date recently and she asked me why I only had one hand on a steering wheel while we were driving to our destination. The answer to that is simple. I grew up on a farm and the first vehicle I learned to drive was my dad's tractor when I was 9. Yes, farm kids learn to drive very early on in life, especially if they are fast-growing bean sprouts like me. Like many vehicles, tractors have the pedals for clutch, brake, and gas, and the steering wheel. In addition to those, you have the implement controls for the tools the tractor is pulling alongside the gear shift and engine speed. These are typically on the right-hand side and usually require you to keep one hand on them, with the other hand on the wheel. These days, I drive an automatic transmission vehicle, but having driven tractors and large manual transmission trucks through the fields for so many years as a kid left me with the habit of resting my right arm on the center console, since there is nothing I need to do with it except maybe hold hands with my dates. This is something my dad does all the time when he and my mom are in a car together, either on their own or with me and my siblings in tow. And no, for anyone who is wondering, my phone stays in my pocket until I've reached my destination. Answering a text while driving is not worth mine or anyone else's safety. So back to the story. Entering sophomore year, I was now old enough according to my state's laws that I could take a driver's education course, something my high school offered as an extracurricular class. I aced that class in every respect, until it came time to get in a car with the instructor. The driving portion of the class had 2 sessions each, one in the morning before school started, and one in the afternoon after school let out, with extra sessions on Saturdays to handle all the prospective drivers in the class. We were sorted alphabetically, so our instructor, Mrs. Tyrant, had an easier time keeping track of us. She was a thin woman with a constant scowl and despised pointless questions. I got a ride with a friend this Saturday morning. It was his and my turn on the list, alongside one other student. It was a weekend before Thanksgiving and getting close to winter, but it hadn't snowed yet. I was therefore bone cold outside. Mrs. Tyrant was waiting inside the exam car with the engine running. The other student got out of her mom's truck once she saw us, and her mom and my friend's dad both drove away once we were in the exam car. I was going to be the first to drive that morning with my friend and the other student in the back seat waiting for their turns. We went through the checklist of pre-driving safety checks and then we were on our way. I put the car in gear, rested my arm on the center console since it was an automatic and there was nothing I needed to use it for. At least that's what I thought, and I pressed the gas. Nothing. Both hands on a wheel, Mrs. Tyrant sternly said with her foot on the examiner's brake. I apologized and put my right hand on a wheel, and it was so weird, especially since I was accustomed to not doing that. As such, my right hand slackened and dropped to the center console again before we even left the parking lot. Cue the brake. Both hands on a wheel, Mrs. Tyrant repeated. I tried to explain why it felt weird, but she wouldn't let me get a word in. If you're not going to keep both hands on a wheel, you can use your little phone to call for a ride home. I don't have a phone, I protested. Really, at this point in time, I didn't have a cell phone, and I'm ultimately grateful to my parents for refusing to buy me one. But this was another point in my teenage years where I wished they would have bought me one. Don't be ridiculous. You kids all have phones. Mrs. Tyrant said that she put the car in park and gestured for me to get out. I complied and tried to get in the back seat while my friend got into the driver's seat. I said, call for a ride home, Mrs. Tyrant repeated. My friend tried to talk her out of leaving me there, only for her to threaten me with a failed test. We all know what teenagers can be like, and he chose a driving test over his friend. He and I still talk and play games together from time to time, but he does regret leaving me behind. So I was left there, in the school parking lot on a Saturday morning in the freezing cold, my only shelter being the school's entryway. Thankfully, I wasn't out there for long, maybe about 20 minutes when some dude I hadn't met before kept honking until I noticed him. My parents later scolded me for trusting a stranger, and I don't blame them. But at the time, I was too cold to care, and his car was warm. Turned out he was a girl's older brother. He had graduated 6 years earlier and was visiting his parents for Thanksgiving that coming week. His sister, the other student, had frantically texted her family since she did have a phone to tell them that I needed help, and he came over to the school straight away to take me back to my house. Mom was furious after I told her what had happened when I got home and called my dad, who was out in the fields, who was equally furious at the news. Despite their immediate efforts, Mrs. Tyrant and the school suffered no consequences, since there weren't any security cameras around the school at the time. Meanwhile, I not only ended up with a nasty cold that lasted until after Thanksgiving Day, but also got flunked out of the driver's education course and wouldn't be allowed to take the course again that year. Fast forward to May, the sun was out and shining, and the end of the school year had arrived. The only bad note on my report card was a driver's education course, which had done just enough damage to take me off the potential valedictorian lineup for my graduating class. As usual for summer, my dad needed help out in the fields, but instead hired a few neighbors so I could take a summer driver's education course that he paid for. So I could be more useful around the place, he joked. But I knew it was because of Mrs. Tyrant failing me before I even had a chance, and that I had otherwise earned the privilege with my good grades. Each day he or mom would take the time each day to deliver me to and pick me up from the course in the nearest city about half an hour away. The instructor for this course, Mr. Saint, was a big man with a bellowing laugh, and he took the time to listen to his students' concerns. Eventually, it came time for me to get behind the wheel again. When I told my dad on our way there, he got all thoughtful for a good minute. Son, I want you to briefly explain to Mr. Saint, before you even get in a car with him, that you've been driving tractors for several years now, as well as how the controls for one are laid out if he isn't familiar with them. He says to me. I didn't really get it at the time, but I agreed to do just that. And just that I did when Mr. Saint invited me to climb into the driver's seat for my driving exam. He was familiar with the typical layout of tractor controls, so I didn't have to explain it to him. He kept a very careful eye on me and everything I did during the driving exam. And unlike Mrs. Tyrant, he didn't touch his brake once. Just like any farming kid I've had in my courses, your driving is top-notch. Mr. Saint says to me, but why did you feel a need to let me know ahead of time? Well, my dad told me to. I said, pointing to my dad who was waiting in his truck. Mind if I speak with him? Mr. Saint asked. I don't mind, sir, but he's going to want to leave soon so we can get back to work. I'll be sure to make it quick, Mr. Saint said as he went over to my dad's truck. They talked for a couple of minutes, Mr. Saint making notes on his clipboard before Dad waved me over when they were done talking. What did Mr. Saint want to talk with you about, Dad? I asked as I climbed in. Oh, nothing much, Dad replied with a grin as he began to drive away. I tried to get him to tell me what they had talked about, but he remained adamantly silent about the matter. A few weeks later, I had my learner's permit and was quickly racking up the hours I needed for my license. The school year started about a month later, and I was asked by a few friends if I would be redoing driver's ed. I told them no, I had taken a summer course since my dad needed my help sooner rather than later, and I already had my learner's permit. And that's when I found out that Mrs. Tyrant had been fired just a week before, and that Mr. Saint would be teaching the course in her place until the school board decided whether they would keep the course or drop it altogether. During my lunch break that first day, rather than eat with my friend, I went to the classroom where Mr. Saint was going to be teaching that afternoon and found him sitting behind what used to be Mrs. Tyrant's desk. After a bit of stuttering on my part, I asked him what had happened, and he said he had been recommended by my dad as a replacement when Mrs. Tyrant's teacher's license was revoked, and when she was subsequently fired. Also, Mr. Saint told me that my dad had stayed in contact with him after their little chat, and that he had been told of Mrs. Tyrant's treatment of me and possibly other students. Mr. Saint then passed that info along with his records onto the county, who pulled Mrs. Tyrant into a performance review. And yep, I wasn't the only one she had flunked over the years for what was perceived as one of many minor errors in this farmland-rich area. That alone was enough to make sure she could never renew her license ever again. What, or rather who, got it revoked were my parents, who finally had people listening to them about how Mrs. Tyrant had neglected her duty as a guardian to her students by leaving them stranded in front of the school until they were picked up, and I was practically the final straw. The school board also invested in a security system at this time, so they had video footage for incidents like this that popped up in the future. Furthermore, my driver's education grade was purged from the system, along with anyone else currently in the school who had taken the class under Mrs. Tyrant, both good and bad. And this put me back in a potential valedictorian lineup for my class, much to my parents' delight. Imagine a bank in a beach town in Costa Rica, named after a pink bird. The employees are locals and the customers are a mix of locals and foreigners. Suddenly, a couple who looks and acts like angry TV characters enters. The man reminds us of Larry David but angrier, and his wife is acting very entitled as well. I'll call them Larry-like and Karen. I was sitting close by trying to read my book when their loud complaints caught my attention. They were mad because the bank wouldn't accept a handwritten note for a deposit like in New York City, where they are from. They had moved here 3 months ago, needed to open a bank account, and were upset because they brought the wrong paperwork. Banks here need proof that the money you're depositing is legit from a job, investment, or inheritance, especially if it's a lot of money. This is to prevent money laundering. The couple didn't understand or didn't care about these rules. The situation escalated when the man threatened to physically attack the bank clerk. It was clear that no matter what paperwork they had, their attitude wasn't going to get them any help. When they started making threats, I intervened. It turns out that this was their third attempt at a different bank, behaving the same way each time. The moral is, in Costa Rica, being polite and respectful to the locals, known as ticos, goes a long way. This place has its own pace and rules, different from the US, and it's important to adapt and respect that. If you're rude, refuse to speak Spanish, and demand everything be like back home, you won't get far. People will just avoid you. Larry, Locke, and Karen didn't seem to get that, making things harder for themselves. So yeah, they ended up storming out of the bank, clearly not understanding that their behavior wasn't going to fly here. It's like they thought they could act any way they wanted and still get what they want. That's not how things work in Costa Rica, especially in these laid-back beach towns. After they left, the atmosphere in the bank went back to normal. The employees and other customers seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. It was clear that everyone was used to a certain level of kindness and respect here. The couple's outburst was out of place. The bank clerk, who had been the target of their anger, was surprisingly calm after the incident. It is as if the locals have a special patience for dealing with difficult people. Maybe it's the Pura Vida lifestyle, a local saying that means pure life or simple life. It's about living life to the fullest and treating others